Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. It's not at all unusual on a given evening for my precious wife and I to enjoy a movie together or a television show of some sort. And these are the shows that often become that which we talk about in our curating your movie library conversations. But like most people, when I'm watching a movie, I like to enjoy something tasty to eat. And so it's not at all uncommon that we'll start a movie and partway through I'll decide, now is the time for me to make myself a bowl of ice cream. And I hop up and head out to the kitchen and scoop up and scoop up and scoop up. I typically have 3 different flavors of ice cream mixed together in one bowl. We're blessed to enjoy homemade brand from United Dairy Farmers here in the area. It's outstanding ice cream. Well, when I do that, it sometimes happens that I come back to watch the movie and all of a sudden I'm completely lost. How did we get here? Well, for today's ism, I want to talk about a situation like that, not with ice cream and not with movies, but in the history of the church, particularly in these United States. For today's ism, we're going to look at Unitarianism. Unitarianism is an ideology that came somehow on the heels of Puritan New England. When I was in high school, I was blessed to attend an adult Sunday school class at the church that I attended that was taught by none other than Dr. John Gerstner, my father's mentor, live and in person. And this class was on the Puritans, and he called it the church at its best. And I'd be willing to agree with that assessment, that there may have been no greater time of the church except during that time of the Puritans. And yet when you turn around, like I say, the next thing you know, there's maybe the last great Puritan, Jonathan Edwards, and you had this great awakening. And the next thing you know, Unitarianism has taken over New England. Well, what is it? And how did it happen? I don't honestly know. That's what I'm saying. I come up, like I blinked and everything changed. Well, I know what motivated it. Why it dug in, I'm not so clear. I do have a suspicion. Unitarianism is not simply taking the Christian faith and denying the Trinity and affirming the oneness of God. That's not the essence of it. I'm not sure why it's called Unitarianism, because of the essence of Unitarianism is not only a denial of the deity of Christ, but a denial of the supernatural reality of the Christian faith at all. It is the reducing of the Christian faith down to a set of moral convictions. You look at Jesus, you think, oh, what a great moral teacher, and we're going to hold on to that. We're going to toss out the virgin birth. We're going to toss out the deity of Christ. We're going to toss out the resurrection. And we're going to hold on to this idea that there is a God, there's one God, and that God made us, and that he calls on us to do well and to do right, and that Jesus serves as an example of what it means to do well. And that's it. That's the sum total of it. I suspect that it took over New England the way things typically happen with respect to institutions apostatizing, that what happened was having a conviction and a commitment to a well-educated clergy, and then pride coming into that process, eventually ended up with an insistence that the men who were training men for ministry would be trained by scholars in Germany, where liberal theology had already taken hold, and that got imported over to New England and spread from there. And we see much the same thing being spread in our day. I don't know if I'd say spread, since it's a pretty moribund ideology. There aren't too many people, in a sense, self-consciously embracing Unitarianism in our day, but it's still there in the Unitarian Universalist Church. But they are so reluctant to affirm anything that there's really no reason to go there. I once had a friend who quipped, "I knew I had to move when the Unitarians burned a question mark in my front yard." The Spirit, however, is very much with us. I don't know if you've ever been involved in these conversations where there's let's just take the Christian baker in Colorado who didn't want to bake the cake for the gay wedding celebration, and became huge news and became a court case and continues to get covered, and there would always be some, news coverage that would interview people, and the people who were upset with this baker would say, "Now look, I'm a Christian. I try to follow Christ. And I just think that's terrible, horrible, bigoted, yada, 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 and Jesus wants us to love everybody, blah, 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 blah." You can recognize that Unitarian spirit when someone defines the essence of Christianity as the attempt to follow Jesus' moral example. Now, please do not misunderstand me. Are we called to follow Jesus' moral example? Of course we are. Is it essential part of the Christian faith? Of course it is. But the Christian faith begins and is defined by our recognition of our inability to do just that, our recognition of our sin, and our dependence on the grace of God, which comes to us through the death of Jesus, who was God incarnate and who was raised from the dead. You can't gut the supernatural from the Christian faith and still have the Christian faith. Again, that's why J. Gresham Machen wrote his classic book, Christianity and Liberalism, because it's not one thing. They're two different things. And we would be wise to remember that, and to be on our guard against this spirit. Not necessarily the temptation to embrace the ideology, because the ideology has anything to commend it. It doesn't. But the trap of seeking out respectability and where it leads every single time. I mentioned in another segment my surprise that we have seemingly survived so far the absence of ongoing sports in this era of COVID-19. That doesn't mean, as I mentioned in that segment, that we have not talked about sports. We just haven't had live games from the leagues that we're used to going on to talk about. And among the things that we've talked about, not surprisingly, given the nature of the national conversation in our day with respect to George Floyd, there's been a great deal of conversation about race and sports. The saga of Colin Kaepernick has risen again. Colin, a few years ago, seems to have led or sparked the habit of some NFL players to kneel during the singing of the national anthem as a means of communicating their concern over racial issues. And that created a great controversy and pushback. And then the accusation has been made that Kaepernick has been blackballed from the league because of that. And I'm not here to talk about any of that. Instead, I want to talk about something positive about race and sports. You see, they say that racism is learned behavior, that it's something that children pick up from their elders, that it's not something that comes terribly naturally. It may be widespread, but it doesn't come naturally, that people naturally have no interest or no more concern about skin color than they do anything else. Interestingly, I think I can tell this story. When I was in kindergarten, for some reason or another, my kindergarten teacher let my parents know that she was concerned that I might have some racial issues in my own heart and mind. She did so graciously. I think she was profoundly misguided and don't have any idea where she got that idea, especially given the fact that my two best friends in kindergarten were both boys from an African-American family. Well, she was African-American as well, and she raised this concern to my parents, and my parents vowed to look into it. Well, about that time, the church where my father served welcomed in an out-of-town guest speaker, and that out-of-town guest speaker came and ate at our house. And in the course of conversation, my parents mentioned this issue, and this speaker so maybe he would help and see if he could discern anything about this. And he began to address little 5-year-old me. So, Craig, he said, that's what I went by then. So, Craig, I understand you're in kindergarten. And I said, yes, sir, I sure am. And, well, how do you like it? Oh, I like it a lot. Well, tell me about your class. Who are some of your friends? Oh, Roosevelt's one of my friends, and Washington's one of my friends. And I just, these are my, and what about your teacher? Tell me about your teacher. And I said, well, she has brown eyes, and she has dark hair, and she's really nice. And then I looked at my mom, and I held out my hands right in front of my chest and said to this out-of-town preacher, she's got really big, what do you call these things again, Mom? So, as a little 5-year-old, I didn't have, I don't think, any racial issues. But it wasn't long after that. It was the next year I had moved to rural Western Pennsylvania. And certainly I had friends who were racist, and I had very little occasion to interact with people of different races. But this is where sports comes in. It's probably also that time in my life when racial issues became a non-issue to me. Because it was at that point in my life that I fell in love with sports. And when you fall in love with sports, you don't care about the color of your heroes. In 1971, the Pittsburgh Pirates became the first team to field a starting lineup in which everyone was dark-skinned African American or Central American. All 9 players. And the manager at the time was an older Irish American fella, Danny Murtaugh, and he was asked, do you realize that this is what just happened? This is the first time in the history of baseball this has happened. He said, no, I didn't realize it. I didn't think about it. I put out the 9 guys that I thought were going to win. And that's how fans think too. When I was a kid, my heroes were Roberto Clemente, Willie Stargell, Manny Sanguin was my favorite Pittsburgh Pirate. On the Steelers squad, Franco Harris, Lynn Swann, Mel Blount. In fact, the Steelers squad in 1974 had a quarterback controversy. Most people don't know this, but Terry Bradshaw, even though he'd been with the team for 4 years by this point, and even though eventually he would lead us to a Super Bowl that very year, but at the beginning of the season, he didn't start, in part because of the players' strike that had happened during training camp. And though he was on the roster the first week, but the starting quarterback was a fellow by the name of Joe Gilliam, Jefferson Street Joe, who was African American. But he could sling that football. And that was a joy and a delight to 9-year-old me. That's all I cared about. And in fact, when we would go out and toss the football, I didn't pretend to be Terry Bradshaw. I pretended to be Joe Gilliam, because Joe Gilliam could really, really throw the ball. Now, I say that to see and to encourage us to recognize one of the blessings that comes from sports. It gives us a different priority, the priority of victory, and a different identity. It didn't cross my mind to think about where these players were from or where their ancestors were from. What mattered to me is where they were playing. They were playing in Pittsburgh. And because of that, they were my guys. So there's something good that can come from sports. When you're heroes, when you become colorblind to your heroes, that's a good thing. I understand that it happens. There's a fair amount of interest in the question of what's changed in my thinking over the years. Well, one would think that by now I'd be used to people telling me what it is that I believe. For years, I had people bundling me together with the Federal Vision crowd, despite the fact that I had spoken publicly against it and written extensively against it. I've been accused of being a Democrat, oddly, because I tend to grumble that the Republicans aren't near conservative enough for me. And more recently, I've been accused of leaving the Reformed tradition. I get that makes for interesting reading, a man bites dog story, that if I were ever to veer away from the convictions that my father taught me, the ones that we both found in the Bible, it would be noticed. I understand as well that my public sins make me, in the minds of many, fair game for slander and suspicion. The boring truth is that my theological convictions remain essentially unchanged. It is true that I have moved from what I've always called myself as a leaky cessationist to what I would now describe as a cautious continuationist. That, however, is about as big a change as moving from being an optimistic amillennialist to a postmillennialist. It's no seismic shift. In fact, it's barely even noticeable. That my theological convictions remain unchanged, however, doesn't mean I have remained unchanged. My convictions haven't moved. My roots, however, have dug deeper. I've always believed that the evangelical church is the visible church. Now I'm learning that evangelicals are my brothers and sisters. I've always believed that theological precision is not an accurate measure of spiritual maturity. Now I'm learning that people I disagree with theologically are often the people I look up to. I've always believed that our problem is that we have too low a view of our own ongoing sin issues. Now I'm learning that I have too low a view of my ongoing sin issues. I've always believed God is sovereign over all things. Now I'm learning he is sovereign even over people who don't understand that he is sovereign over all things. I've always believed the Proverbs, like all the Bible, are inerrant, infallible, true. Now I'm learning that we are all eager to feast upon tasty morsels of gossip. That said, the other day I received an encouraging note from a man I've had little contact with the past 5 years or so. Among other things, he had this to say. When you came upon hard times, my heart was full of compassion for you. I cannot imagine what you've had to endure. The loss of position and title, the loss of respect and honor, the guilt and shame of bringing reproach on the names you bear, Sproul and Christ, and the tremendous weight of burden you may carry, I'm speculating, for following in the footsteps of a great theologian and father. I don't say this to dig up old wounds, but to say this. Greater men would have caved and not repented or returned to the God they profess. Remaining in the shame and sin, unfortunately, may have been easier. Sinners are always eager to welcome a fallen sheep into their fold. Seems to be well received by the world. Instead, you have exemplified the true Christian walk to me and to all who remain with you. What is your oft-repeated advice? Repent and believe the gospel. You have remained consistent, practicing what you preach. End quote. Friends, I believe in the solas of the Reformation, the doctrines of grace, in the sovereignty of God, in the victory of Jesus. I believe husbands are to lead their families. Elders are to lead their churches. I believe the Bible is the Word of God, inerrant, infallible, sufficient. Above all, however, I believe this, that the Lord Jesus came into this world to save sinners, of which I am the chief. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.